This week, I wanted to kind of circle back to the DB deploy stuff I showed last week, where we kind of refactored Dewdrop's DB deploy into a lot of smaller classes so that it's easier to maintain, but also so that it could be used in a different context. In this particular case, we were trying to use it for all of the different per customer databases and process the basics. Uh, I want to come back to those classes this week and show how you would write some basic unit tests for those classes. I've got some written already, and then we'll add a test or two for one of the classes that isn't tested quite yet. So for a lot of you, this might be review, but I think it's good to kind of revisit this every once in a while to make sure that we're all pretty comfortable with these tools. So to get started, let's just look at how you actually run test in PHPUnit and how you decide what to test next and so on. So the first thing is I've got this command ready to go to run PHPUnit. You'll notice I'm using a few different flags. The important ones are -c here is pointing PHPUnit to a configuration file. And that's important because that configuration will bootstrap the environment. So it's going to, for example, get your autoloader set up, maybe set up some global variables if you had any. So for instance, when you're testing a WordPress project, you have to make sure certain things are available or WordPress won't work to let you run your test. And then the next bit here, coverage HTML, is saying that I want to generate a code coverage report when running these tests. And a code coverage report is basically going to say which lines of code were executed when running these tests. And that will highlight areas in our code base that we haven't tested yet and that we need to write some new tests for. Right away when I run this, I want to point out an error or a warning that we're getting from PHPUnit. And that's that xdebug isn't loaded, so it can't generate a code coverage report. A lot of times you might not want to run with xdebug 24/7 because it slows things down quite a lot. So just be aware of that. When you're doing unit testing, you might need to enable xdebug. So that's what I'm doing here. Just in my configuration, I'm uncommenting that line to load that extension. Now, if I rerun my command, it shouldn't give me that warning anymore, and it will take quite a bit longer because it has to generate that code coverage report at the end. So let's let that generate, and then we will open it up in our browser. And this is all static content once it's generated, so you can just kind of open it as a file in your browser. It doesn't have to be in a document root or anything like that. Now in this case, we're only running a particular small set of tests, the DB deploy test. So most of the code base isn't going to be hit. So the first thing we want to do is hop into the particular folder that we're testing. So in this case, we're in the DB deploy folder. And we can see that a couple of the classes are very well covered at this point, but the commands themselves are not covered at all. So let's first look at the ones that do have some coverage and see what that looks like. So when you're looking at a code coverage report, the green lines are the ones that are covered by a test. And if you hover over them, PHPUnit will tell you how many times that line of code or that statement, more accurately, is run during the testing process. So you can kind of get a feel for, okay, like a whole bunch of tests hit this, or maybe only one test hits this. We'll see in the changelog gateway class that we're not getting 100% code coverage. And in a lot of cases, that's okay. And I think this is one of them, really. We'll see that the lines that aren't covered in this class are exceptions that really shouldn't happen at all. So in this case, it would be, if a temporary file that we just attempted to write or we are in the process of attempting to write isn't there, then that would indicate that we have some kind of major permissions issue on the file system. So it could happen, and we want to halt execution if it does, but our test doesn't really need to simulate that. That's not important. So 100% coverage is not always the goal necessarily, but you want to make sure that you're hitting the major code paths in the class that you're testing. So looking at the tests themselves for those two classes, the changelog gateway and the change set, there are a few important concepts to note. The first, and we'll start with the change set because it has more complex dependencies, is the concept of mocking your dependencies, which basically means putting like a test double in place that can simulate the behavior of a dependency without actually requiring that dependency be executed. So in this case, our changelog gateway has a method where it checks to see if the changelog table exists in the database. That's useful when we're running in production or actually running the program. But in the case of the test for the change set, we're just going to assume that changelog table is there because we don't actually want to talk to the database. We just want to simulate talking to the database. And similarly, for the get current revision for change set, we don't need to actually look at the log in the database when we're testing the change set class because that's not really its responsibility. We just want to simulate a value being returned from that gateway class. So for each of these tests, we can see that the gateway that we're giving it is told, in this case, for example, to return a revision number of 8 all the time without actually talking to the database. And the reason that we're mocking the dependency in this way is we only want to test the specific class that this test case relates to. If we end up testing all of our dependencies at the same time, then when a test fails, it's harder to locate exactly where that failure happened. It could be in one of the dependencies, or it could be in the class that we're testing. So by simulating and thereby reducing the complexity of the dependencies, we make it very clear when a test fails in this test case that it is in the change set class that the problem occurred. So that's why we're mocking the changelog gateway when we're testing change set. Now, in the test cases that are intended for changelog gateway, we don't mock the database because we actually want to make sure that our changes get written into the database correctly. And the reason is that the changelog gateway has that responsibility. Its whole purpose is to talk to the database. So for example, if we look in the class, when it's getting the current revision, it is querying the database asking for the maximum change number for that change set. Well, if we were to mock this database adapter and have, a mock fetch one that returned a hard-coded value, then we wouldn't know if this query actually was written correctly. So that's why in the case of the changelog, where its responsibility is to talk to the database, we don't mock the database adapter. So when we're talking about something like this, which is talking to an external system like a database or a web service, the way that we test it is to actually look at that external system. So in this case, a good example would be when we run this code in the changelog gateway class. If the changelog table doesn't exist in the database, we want to make sure that it gets automatically created. So the first time that someone's running DB deploy on their dewdrop project, it should automatically add that changelog for them. They shouldn't have to do that manually as an extra step. So the way that we can do that is at the beginning of the test, we make sure that the changelog doesn't exist. So we ask the database to list its tables, and we make sure that the changelog isn't in that array that's returned from the database adapter. Then we run the code in the changelog gateway that implicitly should tell it to create the changelog. And then we ask the database again, hey, list your tables, and is the changelog there now? So we're looking at the external system that should be affected by our code and asking it if we see the side effect we expect. Now, of course, we also need to clean up after ourselves, or in this case, before ourselves, by using the setup method. So setup can be useful for getting a common resource together, a lot like an init method and a Zen framework controller or something like that. But also, in this case, we want to make sure that changelog doesn't exist when we start running the test. So if we see it in the database during our setup method, we drop it from the database right then. And that way we have kind of a known state every time one of these tests starts. So we're not getting unpredictable results when we're running the test multiple times. For those who haven't worked with PHPUnit much before, note that there's also a teardown method, which would be run after every test. So if you wanted to clean something up or unset some variables or something like that after each test, you can do that there. PHPUnit will try to do some of that for you. For example, it has a backup globals feature where it will keep track of the values of global variables before and after test and reset them when the test completes. That's very useful when testing WordPress code because there are so many global variables at play. Hopefully for code that you're writing yourself, that doesn't really come into play too often. So those are some examples of tests so far on these two classes. Again, in the case of the change set, we're relying pretty heavily on mocking our dependencies so that we don't have to bring in additional variables into the test environment. And in the case of the gateway, its responsibility is to talk to that external system. So we don't mock it. We actually ask that external system, hey, does this exist now like I expect it to? So now we're going to do just a quick test or two of this status command from the db-deploy library. And this should be pretty straightforward, but we'll just kind of walk through the class really quick. The bulk of the command's logic is going to happen during the execute method. So we're going to have to call that. And then to be able to see the side effects or to see if the execute method did what we expect, there are a couple of different things we can do. The first is we can rely on these public methods and the status command to see, okay, after calling execute with these predefined change sets that I'm giving it, how many changes are available, and also, give me the list of changes grouped by the change set, and let me see if that matches what I expect as well. So we can ask those public methods, and we can also give this command some mock change sets and monitor to see if these methods on the change set are called. So we know that for every change set we give the status command, it should be calling get current revision and get available revision. And using the mock object API, we can either just check to see if that call happens, or we can make sure those calls have a predefined return value, making it easy for us to predict what's going to happen during the test. So let's write our test case class and try to get a couple tests added to our suite. So to check back real quick on what we had, currently have 10 tests and 22 assertions. All of those are passing. So let's go ahead and make a new test case for the status command. You'll note that the file structure for your test basically just mimics the file structure of your project or your library, the actual code from your project or library, as closely as possible. So in this case, the Dewdrop library is up here in our Composer vendor folder. And then in that same Composer library, we've got a test folder that has a dewdrop library folder. And that dewdrop folder mirrors the library's code itself. So we're going to add in here a command folder, again, to kind of match what's in the library. And then we'll add a status test file. And the namespace is always the same as the actual class that you're testing. So in this case, that's dewdrop db deploy command. And it's always going to extend from PHPUnit framework test case. So before we even add a test, we can see that when you just have a test case and no test added to it, PHPUnit will tell you that. So you can start off with the quick failure right off the bat, and then dive back in to actually add your test. So first thing is we've got this dummy change set here that has two files. If we've got a current revision of 0, then we would expect the status command to return the value 2 from get available changes count after calling execute. So in order to get this set up, we basically need to instantiate the status command itself and give it at least one change set. In this case, we'll just do the dummy change set that's in this folder here. So we've got to get all of those classes wired up very similarly to in the change set test test case here, except we're going to mock a few additional methods when we do that. So we've got to be able to give a gateway to the change set class, and then we've got to mock some of the change set methods so that they're always going to return a certain value. So in this case, I'm actually just going to pull the get mock gateway method for speed's sake into this test case over here. So now our change set won't have to talk directly to the database again. Let's go ahead and say that we're using these classes as well. And Darby wants to see some test docs output because it is pretty awesome. Test docs is a cool style of reporting on your tests. Oops. Is that what the argument's called, Darby? Is it something like report equals test docs?
You got it. Oh. It's test docs, just no dash.
Okay. Gotcha. This will basically, and we've now got partially written syntax in our test here. 1 second. basically what test docs will do is take your test method names, which you can tell, like I'm being very verbose with these test method names. So I said test two available changes when using dummy change set. Well, the reason that I'm writing it out really long like that is then if you output it as test docs, it's going to write it almost as like a requirement checklist that you would have when starting the project. So it's almost like you've got your requirements for each test, and they're being checked off as you pass the test. So it's another cool way that PHPUnit can kind of display the almost like the spec for the class. So we've got our mock gateway infrastructure copied over from the change set test, which if you were doing something, complicated wiring like this more frequently in a lot of test cases, I would say, let's put that in a place where it's easier to reuse that code. But when it's just used in one or two test cases, I usually will just kind of copy and paste when it comes to the unit tests. It's a little, standards are a little different when you're in the test code versus the actual code, in the sense that you don't usually like see full API docs in the unit tests themselves, for example. So let's go ahead and make our dummy change set now. So we're going to give it the mock gateway. And again, in this case, we're just going to say the revision is 0. So this is as if the user had no changes applied to their database. And we were using the dummy change set, which is available in the folder right above where we are right now. So in this case, we're going to go up a level to dummy change set. So now we've got the change set object. We can pass that on to the actual status command. Now the status command itself doesn't have any dependencies other than an array of change sets. So we're pretty much ready to go at this point. We will just create our actual command. So this is a new status, and then give it the array of change sets. And then we can execute it and assert that one of those output variables that we have from the command is equal to an expected amount. And in the assertions for PHPUnit, it's typically the expected value comes first, and then the actual value from running the test comes second. And it's important to keep that in mind because the output can be confusing otherwise. So you want to kind of get in the habit of doing things that way. So let's go ahead and rerun our test and see if we've got things working or if we're missing anything. And it looks like I'm missing a use statement, basically. So I've got this mock database adapter that can be used. I need to add that in here. And that's just basically a database adapter that doesn't ever talk to a database server. It just kind of runs the command. So if you're not really expecting to write to the database, it's an easier way to get up and running, and will keep your test nice and fast. I did something wrong. Adapter. Oh, as mock adapter. And we can see now we've got our additional test running here. So 2 available changes when using dummy change set. That passes now. We'll go ahead and let the code coverage report update. And once that does, we should see that we have more coverage on the status command. And probably quite a few of the lines covered, even though this test is somewhat shallow as far as what it actually checks. Yeah, so at this point, just with that one test, we are hitting most of the lines of code in the status command. Simply, I mean, it's a very simple class, so that's not terribly surprising. Uh, the only thing we're not really hitting is the get available changes by set, which is just additional output. So even in our current change set, we could just add another assertion to see if that output also matches what we expect. But I'm going to leave that as an exercise for later. Um, so yeah, now we've increased our test coverage by hitting this class. And again, you know, the test cases for this class, because its responsibility isn't really dealing with the database, it's dealing with change sets, which is a higher level abstraction. Uh, this test will never actually hit the database, and you don't have to pull in DBUnit or anything like that to set up data sets before and after and so on. So that's a decent little walkthrough of doing some PHPUnit testing when you've got pretty well broken down uh, simple classes with relatively simple dependencies as well. Any questions before we wrap up?
Yeah, I had a question, Brad.
Okay.
I noticed in your test as you were editing the code there, as you were adding assertions, it looked like you had um, automatic completion support for the available assertion methods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I didn't do anything to get that, so I'm assuming it's built into PHP Storm, but I could be wrong. Um,
Okay. It does have some built-in support for that. I was curious if you might have done something to set that up. I had to do something um, with mine to handle projects that are hosted in Vagrant.
the
Um,
other thing to note is I do have uh, Dewdrop depending on PHPUnit, at
okay,
least
yeah,
as a development dependency. So it might be finding it in my include path here and then
right,
figuring it
yeah.
out. I bet that's probably what's going on. But
Yeah, it's part of your project, so it finds those. But for projects that don't have the PHP unit library bundled, and where you're just using the include path to your pair libraries, you might have to do something a little special to get that very useful uh, code completion for the PHP unit methods. Um, I have a line I added to my Vagrant file to make that work. And I'll
okay,
paste it in for everybody here, just in case they might run into a similar thing. So this that I just pasted into the GoToMeeting chat is a line I added to my Vagrant file. And basically what it does is it exposes the Vagrant box's pair library to the host.
okay,
Um, and then from there you can configure PHP Storm to point to it. So just
gotcha.
in case that's useful for anybody else.
Cool. All right. Well, if anyone wants to try testing part of Dewdrop, there are some areas that definitely could use more tests. Or if you want to try testing a particular part of our project you're working on and you're having trouble figuring out how to get the dependencies wired up or how to mock something, let me know. I'd be glad to walk you through writing a few tests so you can kind of get in the habit of doing it. Uh, it's tricky at first, but gets easier over time. And it's definitely worthwhile having a test case, at least for key parts of the library in your project, or especially things like Dewdrop that we use on so many different projects. We want to have a big test case. So I think that's it. Thanks, guys.
Are you gone yet?
Thanks, Brad.